I thought what I might do is to, as has been suggested, give you something of a feel as to why CEDA decided to do something as significant as this report, and to reflect back on the one that was released in March of this year. Last year, CEDA's board, and Catherine's here as a member of the board, reflected on the fact that there was genuine concern amongst our directors, and I think that reflected Australia's concern more generally, about debate at the political level, about those people that make decisions about Australia's economic and social future, and that concern was really a forgotten issue, was around where the federal government's budget deficit had reached, and that in prospect it wasn't looking too flash. And so when we reflected on that and thought, look, you know, this great country of ours, we've had 25 years of uninterrupted economic growth. We've had a mining investment boom, the likes of which we've never seen. We had terms of trade that had been underpinned by resource pricing, the likes of which we've never seen. But all of this was starting to change, and change radically. And in fact, CEDA was a bit Nostradamus-like in putting out a major piece of research called Australia Adjusting, some 12 or 18 months before people started talking about this, and tried to talk about what was going to be necessary to sustain Australia's economic growth, and therefore the social infrastructure that would sit as part of that. And so, as I say, our board decided that they would create a high-level group of individuals to give advice on how best to tackle that issue about the federal government deficit. Reflect on this: 25 years of continuous uninterrupted economic growth, and yet the last 8 years we've seen the budget deficit, the federal budget deficit, continue to grow. And so what we suggested, offered, was through our expert panel, a sort of an option mix, a mix and match. What was the opposition saying? What was the government of the day saying? Was there a sense of synergy across that amongst all of these? And we found that there was, and we applied a bit of Politics 101, and therefore we suggested by doing these things, you could actually get the budget deficit, the federal budget deficit, under control by 2019. And that's a full year, if not longer, ahead of what the current government is projecting, and indeed the opposition is projecting, with their 10-year growth plan. Now, of course, interesting, when we put it out, and our national chairman, Paul McClintock, released it in Canberra at the National Press Club, there was a flurry of activity around, did it really matter? Well, it mattered some couple of weeks later, when Standard & Poor's and the other rating agencies came out and said, what's being said here is absolutely right, because if the federal deficit isn't brought under control, it will affect the AAA credit rating that Australia has. Why is that important? Because it means government can't borrow it at rates that are better than anybody else can get. It means that people will look at the country that is Australia and say, look, it's going backwards economically, let's find somewhere else we're going to invest. And so a couple of other organisations came along and similarly made some comments around this. Access Economics, Deloitte Access Economics, they raised this as an issue. The Grattan Foundation or Grattan Institute down in Melbourne, they started to talk about this. So it developed a bit of a life of its own. But why we saw this was important, because we said that unless the deficit is brought under control, we're passing on the debt not only to our children but to our grandchildren. In my case, no grandchildren yet, but they will have the debt at some stage in the future. And so, you know, the concern was genuinely there about that. And we thought, well, given we've said if you get the budget deficit under control, you can then start talking about what is the economic future of Australia as we adjust. How do you then marry in a growth strategy based on the fact that, as I've said, the mining investment boom has peaked and in fact has come right off, that we're in certainly a production phase, no doubt about that, but Australia is adjusting. And secondly, what's coming down the turnpike is the greatest industrial revolution, the likes of which the world has never seen, and that is around digital disruption, technology change, robotics, dress it up as however you want to talk about it. But again, CEDA put out a report about this 12 months ago, And we said these are the very issues that we need to confront. And so we formed another expert group and we produced this document. And this document, and I say about all CEDA documents, is a page turner. You will read it tonight. It will not put you to sleep, I guarantee it. It is an absolute page turner. Why? Because it affects everybody in this room and beyond. We have suggested 10 public policy priority areas that an incoming government needs to tackle. And clearly part of that is around economic issues, but it is also about social issues. And you can see the list. Innovation, buzzword of the day, but it means a lot of things. And an innovator to one person is completely different when you talk about it to somebody else. We've talked about competition policy. We've talked about education. Now, I know we've got a group of our very significant and senior Queenslanders here today that are going to be on the panel. But let me tell you, the conversation is not going to be necessarily limited to education. In fact, I know it's not because I'm asking the questions. It is going to be about how our Vice-Chancellors, who have an incredibly diverse background of skills themselves before they were elevated to these exalted positions, how they themselves see all of these things fitting in and where does the university sector play a role, but not simply limited to education. We talk about workforce participation. We talk about infrastructure, fiscal resilience. That is buzzword for saying get the budget under control, please. Somebody do that now, please. Tax reform. Tax reform. You remember last year there was this bloody great table, bigger than any of these tables here, that the public policy makers were talking about, and everything was on it. Somebody came with a great hand and swept everything away. Taxation reform, genuine reform, has disappeared. You've got the opposition at the moment talking about negative gearing. You've got the government talking about business tax relief. But do you hear about anything else? It's piecemeal. And so we say, and again, a CEDA report, by the way, all these things I'm talking about, CEDA's already reported on. Go to our website, see every one of those documents. Fabulous reports. Each one of them a page turner. Each one of them will not put you to sleep, but each one of them is about good public policy outcomes. And so when we talk about tax reform, it then gets married into the next thing, which is federalism. Who has a responsibility for doing what to whom and who pays? Federal, state, local government. How do we have a distribution of the tax take? You know, we had a 24-hour thought bubble some time ago about saying we'll give the taxation powers, or some of them, to the state government. That's how long it lasted. That is not tax reform. That is not federation discussion. That is simply putting something out there to see if it's going to fly and then it disappears. We say those issues need to be back on the table. Who remembers GST, those 3 words that everybody shies away from? Who remembers people talking about whether we need to have a land tax to substitute for some of the job-destroying taxes that state governments impose? Who knows, for example, that all the states, just about all of them, when they bring down a budget, and I think the Treasurer here last week or the week before did exactly the same, imposes extra tax on foreign investors in this country. Now, these are things that just happen in isolation. There is no way in which it's all being captured, along with workplace relations and along with, of course, climate change issues. 10 factors that we believe, if appropriately tackled, when the budget deficit is under control, will lead to a growth agenda for Australia. Because, look, like I say now, this conversation we're having here is exactly the same conversation that they're having in Berlin, exactly the same, well, it's not quite what they're having in London at the moment, they're worried about something else, but they will. When they get beyond Brexit, they will get back to how is it, and if they exit, it will be a real conversation over there. It's the same conversations being had in Beijing, it's the same conversations being had in Washington DC. Well, no, over there they're worried about other things, but they will get back to it. Believe me, trust me on this, they will get back to this. It will be about what is it that's going to sustain each of our economies in the face of competition from around the globe, from globalisation, with the threat of digital disruption coming, so that, you know, people don't necessarily, your accountant doesn't have to be just up the road that you go and visit here in Brisbane. Your accountant, in fact, could be in New York. Your banker, by the pressing of a button, spends billions of dollars spinning around the globe. That is the nature of the future of what the world economy is going to be. How do we skill people for that? What do we need to do to bring people into this new economy? Millennials that we hear so much about. Are they really going to be the only people that are going to have jobs in the future? Are we still going to need people that are pulling coffees up at the coffee shop or whatever? Is it going to be a robot like it is in Japan? Fundamentally, having a growth agenda for Australia so that our economy, as we know it now, which is going to transition away from absolute reliance on the mining industry, although significant as that still is, and agriculture, to something else. 70% of Australians are employed in the services sector. What's one of the biggest services sector? Education, higher education. But it's more than that. So how are we going to allow for Australia to prosper, to develop, to grow in the face of international competition? Here are 10 things that we think an incoming government needs to talk about. We've put this out there. We've put it out there on the back of saying get the budget deficit under control so you can pay for some of these things. And if you can do that, then you can have an adult conversation about what we want to be when we grow up as Australia. That time has come now. We cannot afford to let it go any longer. So, go away, be disciples on behalf of CEDA. Take the book with you. Go and stand on the streets here in Brisbane. Talk about it. Townsville, Sandra, when you go back, stand out there and talk about the need to bring under control the budget deficit at the national level, to talk about how state and Commonwealth government relations across a whole myriad of things need to be fixed. Talk about genuine tax reform. Talk about climate change. Talk about all the things that we've mentioned here, because all of our futures collectively is going to be dependent upon it. And of course, the final thing would be, for our friends from the higher education sector, how you train and skill the people for the future becomes a critical element in this. And so we're kind of going to try and draw a little bit of this out after lunch. So I'll leave my comments there. Other than to say, of course, as I started, as always, CEDA documents, brilliant, absolutely brilliant, if I do say so myself. And they're online and you've got a lot of friends, I know, so please tell them about it, distribute it widely, and make sure you have the conversation. You are leaders in your own field. And if we can advocate for these sorts of things, maybe the folks that we're going to elect on the 2nd of July, when they get back to the coldness of Canberra, will take on board the sorts of things that we think are absolutely critical for our future. Thank you. We'll be back just after lunch. Enjoy.